Welcome to my channel. This is Nancy Thompson's Storytelling Corner, where I share folk tales, thrilling mysteries, and all sorts of other topics. I invite you all to join me for today's story. It's a tale set one night during the early days of colonial America. A woman, after putting her young son to bed by the flickering light of an oil lamp, sits down to sew. But deep inside, she feels a gnawing sense of unease, especially from the haunting hoot of an owl outside her cabin. It fills her with an unshakable dread. Emily Carter, skilled with a needle, pricks her finger in her distraction. At her mother-in-law's urging, she reluctantly sets her work aside to rest. As she lies down, she thinks of her husband, who loved her dearly, and tears stream down her face like a summer rain. Just a few months ago, he fell into a ravine and died, leaving her a grieving widow burdened with hardship. Though Emily Carter was born into an ordinary family in a small rural town in Virginia, she had the love of her parents and her older brother, Ethan Carter. Life was simple but warm, until tragedy struck when Emily turned 15. Her parents fell gravely ill with fever. She and Ethan, both devoted to their family, did everything they could to save them, even taking on heavy debt from local lenders. Despite their efforts, their parents passed away, one shortly after the other. The siblings were heartbroken. Worse still, they had no money left to buy coffins or secure a proper burial plot. Ethan, desperate to give their parents peace, suggested Emily sell herself into indentured servitude to raise the funds. But Emily, fiercely protective of her brother, refused outright. As they wept together, unsure of what to do, a man named Leonard Grayson, a wealthy landowner from their town, ambled over. Wiping away a few crocodile tears, he said, "You poor kids, such misfortune. Folks around here stick together. How could I not lend a hand? I've got $10 to spare. Take it, buy some caskets. There's also a patch of land on the hillside behind town. Cheap, only $2. You can bury them there. Totals $12. Just sign a little note, and it's settled." Leonard Grayson owned most of the farmland and woods around town. But everyone knew he was a cold, greedy man with a reputation for vice. His sudden generosity didn't sit right with Emily or Ethan, but they were penniless, and some relatives were already hounding them to repay their debts. With no other choice, they agreed to Leonard's terms, promising to pay him back within a year. After burying their parents and settling what they could with kin and friends, they thought they'd have some breathing room. But less than a month later, Leonard showed up, demanding his money. The siblings begged for more time. After all, the deal was for a year. Leonard just smirked and said, "I did this out of the goodness of my heart. But the note you signed? It's clear as day, interest accrues daily, and I can call in the debt whenever I want. You borrowed $12, but with interest, it's $15 now. If you wait a full year, it'll be $30. With your means, you'll never pay that off in this lifetime." He pressed them relentlessly, his eyes glinting with ulterior motives. Leonard had long coveted Emily's beauty, knowing full well neither she nor Ethan could read the fine print of his predatory contract. His kindness was a trap to bend them to his will. But Leonard didn't stop there. "If you can't pay," he sneered, "that's fine. My house could use a maid. Hand Emily over, and your debt's wiped clean." Emily burst into terrified sobs, but Leonard ignored her pleas. He ordered his hired hands to seize her. Ethan, who'd always shielded his sister, grabbed a woodcutting axe and lunged at them, ready to fight to the death. Neighbors, hearing the commotion, rushed over and condemned Leonard's cruelty. He'd thought the orphan siblings would be easy prey, but Ethan's fierce resistance, and the townsfolk's outrage, caught him off guard. Fearing for his own skin, Leonard cursed and stormed off. As he left, he barked, "You've got 10 days. Either pay up, send Emily to my house as a servant, or I'll take you to court. Debts are debts." How could Emily and Ethan scrape together that kind of money? Still mourning their parents, they clung to each other and wept. After a long silence, Ethan said, "Sis, I'll find a way to get the cash. Even if it kills me, I won't let you go to that monster's house. Worst case, I'll sign up as a laborer on some plantation to clear the debt." Emily, tears in her eyes, replied, "Ethan, no, I can't lose you too. Don't risk your life for me. I'll go be his maid. If he tries anything vile, I'll die before I let him ruin me." Just then, a local matchmaker, Aunt Clara, knocked on their door. Wiping their tears, they asked why she'd come. Aunt Clara was a kind-hearted woman known around town for her matchmaking skills. She stepped inside and said, "I didn't want to bother you too, but Leonard came sniffing around my place this morning, pressuring me about your debt.
I figured I'd better tell you what's what.
Whether you take it or leave it, that's up to you." Ethan frowned. "Aunt Clara, you're not here to set me up with someone, are you? We're dirt poor and owe Leonard a fortune."
What want me now?
"If that's all, maybe you should head back." "Hold your horses," Aunt Clara replied with a chuckle.
Just her out.
"There's a well-off family in the next town over, the Harrisons. Good folks, generous too. They've got one daughter, Charlotte. She's a beauty, like a rose in bloom, and they'd arranged a marriage for her. But last month, she came down with some strange illness. Her face broke out in spots, with weird snake-like marks. The wedding's off now, and she's not the same. Spends her days crying or lashing out at folks. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison are beside themselves. On one hand, Charlotte's condition makes it tough to find a decent match. On the other, even if she marries, they're scared her in-laws might mistreat her. So they're looking for a man to join their family, live with them, you know? Someone honest and hard-working. They're offering a dowry of $50, and the guy doesn't even have to change his name. All they ask is for one son to carry the Harrison name."
Isen gut in, Aunt Clara, I'm in.
"If the Harrisons can stand me, and a few harsh words or a smack now and then, I'll take it. Besides, maybe Charlotte's sickness will clear up someday." Ignoring Emily's protests, he grabbed his coat and followed Aunt Clara to the Harrisons' town. Emily knew she couldn't stop him. Tears welled up as she watched them disappear down the dirt road. When they reached the Harrisons' sprawling farmhouse, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison eyed Ethan up and down. He was sturdy, broad-shouldered from years of labor, and they nodded approvingly. After hearing about his family's woes, they sighed sympathetically. But they were upfront about Charlotte. "She's not easy to handle," Mr. Harrison warned. They called for a maid to fetch her. Even though Ethan had braced himself, Charlotte's appearance still startled him. Her face was mottled with red spots and eerie, twisting marks. Worse, the second she saw him, she started cursing and swinging. The maids tried to hold her back, but she landed a few wild punches on them too. Ethan, determined to see this through, stood his ground and took it all in silence. Eventually, the Harrisons rushed in, pulling Charlotte away with a flurry of apologies. When they returned, Mr. Harrison saw the scratches on Ethan's face and said, "Ethan, I'm so sorry."
You all recht, Nita Doktor?
"You've seen how Charlotte is. Most fellas would have bolted by now, but you didn't. If you're willing, this marriage is set. If not, no hard feelings. I'll give you $20 anyway."
Take it, pay off Leonard, and keep the rest for yourself. No interest, no rush to pay him back.
He handed Ethan a small pouch of coins.
Ethan shook his head.
"Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, I'm sticking to my word. I'll marry Charlotte and take good care of her. I won't let her suffer a bit." The Harrisons, relieved by his resolve, agreed. They'd already prepared the dowry and pulled out another $30. "Here's the full 50, Mr. Harrison said. Wedding's in 3 days. Sound good?" "I only need 20, Ethan replied. 15 to clear Leonard's debt, and 5 for Emily to live on.
I'll head back now.
If you're worried I'll run off, send someone with me." The Harrisons waved off the idea. "We trust you, Ethan," Mrs. Harrison said warmly. "Go settle things and come back." Ethan raced home, found Leonard lounging outside his fancy estate, and shoved the $15 into his hands. He snatched back the debt note, watching Leonard's face twist with frustration as his scheme unraveled.
Grumbling, Leonard slunk away.
Back at the cabin, Ethan handed Emily the remaining $5. Seeing the scratches on his face, she teared up. "Ethan, you're suffering all this for me. I just hope Charlotte gets better soon." "It's nothing," Ethan said, brushing it off. Then he turned to Aunt Clara. "If I'm joining the Harrisons, it's like I'm the one getting married off. My biggest worry is leaving Emily here alone. Could you help her find a good man to settle down with?" Emily's cheeks flushed red. "Ethan, your wedding's in a few days. We've got to get ready. Don't fuss over me. We can't look sloppy for the Harrisons." "Sis, what are you talking about?" Ethan laughed. "Mom and Dad are gone. I'm the man of the house now. It's my job to see you taken care of. Besides, with Leonard still lurking around, how can I leave you here by yourself?" Aunt Clara, sharp as ever, noticed Emily's blush and grinned. "Ethan, you love your sister, I get it. But you don't know a girl's heart. I reckon she's already got someone in mind. Right, Emily?" "No way." Emily sputtered, her face turning scarlet. Sure, Aunt Clara teased. "What about that fella from the next village, Tom Bradley? I've seen you two chatting when he's out chopping wood. Hard-working, kind, respects his folks, a real good kid. His parents aren't in great health, and his family's strapped for cash, but he's solid." Ethan perked up. "Tom Bradley? I know him, he's decent." "Emily, how'd you meet him?" Blushing harder, Emily mumbled, "Well, once when I was out gathering herbs up the hill, I ran into a big rattlesnake. I screamed and bolted, tripped over a root, and that snake was closing in. Tom came running, scared it off, and helped me up. That's how we met. But both our families are broke. We figured neither side would approve, so we kept quiet." Aunt Clara clapped her hands. "Leave it to me. I'll sort this out so you both get your happy endings. Ethan can head to the Harrisons with peace of mind. How's that sound?" Tom Bradley had always liked Emily, but he'd held off proposing. He didn't want her to marry into his struggling family and suffer alongside him, caring for his ailing parents. His plan was to save up enough for a proper dowry and get his folks back on their feet before asking for her hand. But when Aunt Clara showed up at his door with the news that Ethan approved, and that Ethan was set to join the Harrisons, leaving Emily alone, Tom didn't hesitate. He agreed right then and there. Emily and Tom tied the knot the day before Ethan's wedding to Charlotte Harrison. Ethan handed Emily the last $5 as her dowry, tears in his eyes as he sent his little sister off. The next day, he headed to the Harrisons to become their son-in-law. After settling in with Tom, Emily threw herself into her new life, keeping house, tending to her in-laws, and supporting her brother when she could. She even used her dowry money to buy medicine for Tom's parents. With her care, their health steadily improved, and they couldn't stop praising their sweet, dutiful daughter-in-law. Tom, inspired by his new family, worked harder than ever. He tilled fields, chopped firewood, and fished the nearby creek, determined to build a better life for Emily with his own two hands. By October, Emily was expecting, and she gave birth to a boy they named Little Jimmy. Their little family of 5, Tom, Emily, Jimmy, and Tom's parents, might not have been rich, but they were tight-knit and happy. That happiness shattered one morning. Tom had gone up the ridge to chop wood as usual, but before noon, a neighbor rushed in with grim news. Tom had slipped off a cliff and died, his body broken and bloodied. Emily collapsed, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. Tom's parents took it hard too, their fragile health crumbling under the shock. Now Emily had to shoulder it all, working tirelessly to feed her family, raising little Jimmy, and nursing her sickly in-laws with no money for proper medicine. Following an old doctor's advice, she trudged up the hills herself to gather herbs, each step a battle against exhaustion and grief. In those dark days, Emily longed for her big brother Ethan to lend a hand. Back when he'd first joined the Harrisons, he'd visited her often. But after a few months, he seemed to vanish, like mist off the river. When Tom was still alive, they'd gone together to check on Ethan at the Harrisons' farm. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison said he'd left to find a cure for Charlotte and hadn't come back. They added that Charlotte's condition made her unfit to see visitors, so Emily and Tom never met her. Months dragged on. With Emily's tender care, her in-laws' health began to mend. They could pitch in with light chores and watch Jimmy, easing her load just a bit. She breathed a small sigh of relief, but her heart still ached for Tom. If he were here, their little family would be whole. How perfect would that be? And she couldn't shake her worry for Ethan. Why had he been gone so long without a word? That night, as the owl's eerie hoot cut through the stillness, Emily's thoughts spiraled. She pricked her finger again while sewing, wincing at the sting. The owl's cry woke her mother-in-law too, who peeked in and saw the lamp still burning. "Emily, honey," she said, her voice soft with concern, "you're wearing yourself thin. Rest now, don't ruin your health." Emily's mother-in-law had come to see her as a daughter, always bragging to neighbors about her kind, hard-working girl. Emily climbed into bed, but the owl's calls grew louder, sharper. Unable to stand it, she peered out the window. Suddenly, under the moonlight, a shadow darted past, a rattlesnake massive and swift, smashed through the window pane and slithered inside. Emily froze, her first thought flying to Jimmy. He was her hope, her everything. She couldn't let harm come to him. She threw a blanket over him, ready to scream for help, when the snake hit the floor with a thud. It was dead. Lighting the oil lamp with shaky hands, Emily crept closer. The snake's body was gashed, blood pooling from a deep wound. She stared, puzzled. It was dying, not dangerous. Her kind heart stirred. Though she knew little of healing, she understood it needed help fast to stop the bleeding. "Snake," she whispered, "I won't hurt you. I'll stitch you up and bandage that wound." Grabbing her sewing needle, she spoke gently, and the snake, as if it understood, gave a weak nod before collapsing. Emily worked quickly, sewing the gash shut and wrapping it with strips of cloth. Exhausted, she couldn't move the heavy creature and worried what might happen once it recovered. She stayed up all night, perched on the bed, watching it. By morning, the snake stirred, still weak but alive. She told her in-laws everything, and they gaped in shock. "A rattlesnake in the house? That's no small thing," they exclaimed. But since it was injured, they agreed to shift it to a corner of the backyard to heal, scrounging up scraps for it to eat. Over days, it grew stronger, and then one night, it vanished. The next morning, word spread through town. Leonard Grayson had been bitten by a huge snake and died. Emily's tight knot of fear finally loosened. It wasn't that she was heartless. Leonard had tormented her relentlessly since she'd married Tom. Even with Tom around, Leonard never gave up his twisted pursuit. After Tom's death, he'd shown up at her door, proposing again with that oily grin. Emily refused, and when he tried to force his way in, her in-laws stood firm, ready to fight him off. Leonard backed down but kept harassing her whenever their paths crossed, making her life miserable. She'd taken to staying indoors or dragging her mother-in-law along if she had to step out. His death felt like a weight lifting off her chest. That morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, the backyard filled with the cheerful chirping of robins. No more owl hoots to rattle Emily's nerves. With Leonard Grayson gone for good and her in-laws' health on the mend, Emily felt a spark of hope. She decided to head into town to see if Ethan had finally returned. After breakfast, she asked her in-laws to watch little Jimmy and stepped outside to start the trek. But just as she crossed the yard, a fancy carriage rolled up to the gate. A striking young woman, dressed in fine clothes, stepped down and approached. "Does Emily Carter live here?" she asked, her voice warm but curious. Emily nodded, puzzled. She didn't recognize this lady, and they sure didn't have any rich relatives. A maid trailing behind the woman smiled and said, "We've come to deliver a gift for you, and to meet you, Emily. I'm Charlotte Harrison, your sister-in-law." Emily's jaw dropped. "Charlotte? But where's Ethan? Why isn't he with you?" She'd never laid eyes on Charlotte before, knowing only that she'd been plagued by a strange illness. Had Ethan found a cure? Her heart raced with a mix of shock and joy. "Come inside," Emily said quickly, ushering Charlotte in. She introduced her to Tom's parents and little Jimmy, who toddled over with a shy grin. The maid hauled in a pile of gifts, cloth, food, even a few toys, stacking them in the cramped cabin. Emily couldn't wait any longer. "Charlotte, please, where's Ethan been all this time? How'd he cure you? What's going on?" Charlotte took Emily's hand, her eyes soft. "Let me tell you the whole story, Emily. You deserve to know." And so she began. After Ethan joined the Harrisons as their son-in-law, life wasn't easy. Charlotte's illness made her volatile. She'd lash out at him, sometimes with words, sometimes with fists. At night, she'd grow restless, pacing the house while Ethan struggled to keep up. It wore him down, but he was a steady man. He'd promised to stand by her, and to him, Charlotte wasn't just a burden, she was his wife. He couldn't abandon her, not when she needed him most. Still, enduring her fits wasn't a fix. Ethan knew the only real solution was to cure her strange condition. He talked it over with Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, but they just shook their heads. They'd called in every doctor they could afford, tried every remedy they could think of, nothing worked. They were getting older, too worn out to chase cures far afield. So Ethan took matters into his own hands. He grabbed what money he could scrape together and hit the road, determined to find someone who could help. He traveled far, up to Philadelphia, down to Richmond, asking every doctor and healer he could track down. Months passed, and still, no one had seen a case like Charlotte's. Incurable, they'd say, sending him away empty-handed. Defeated, his pockets nearly dry, Ethan turned back toward home, worried the Harrisons would think he'd abandoned them. But as he passed through a small trading post near their town, an odd figure stopped him, a grizzled old preacher, lean and weathered with a glint in his eye. "You're hunting a cure for your wife, ain't you?" the preacher asked, straight out of the blue. Ethan nodded, startled, and spilled the story. "Any ideas, sir?" he pressed. The preacher grinned. "You don't need to roam so far, son. Up that ridge yonder, not half a day's walk, there's a rare herb, call it angel root. Get that, and your wife'll be right as rain." Ethan followed the preacher's gaze to the familiar ridge behind their own town. Doubting but desperate, he took the rough sketch the man handed him, a drawing of the plant, and thanked him. Too eager to detour home or check on Emily, he took a shortcut up the slope. Sure enough, he found the angel root growing wild among the rocks. He plucked it, raced back to the Harrisons, and brewed it into a tea for Charlotte. Within days, her face cleared up, the spots and snake-like marks fading away. Her temper softened too, revealing the gentle woman she'd once been. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison wept with joy, and Ethan felt a quiet pride. But he wasn't done. Sitting with Charlotte one evening, he said, "We're married, sure, but it's never been proper, not with you so sick. Now you're well, and I know I'm just a poor farmer's son. If you want to leave me, find someone better, I won't hold it against you." Charlotte's eyes welled up. "Ethan, you're my husband. I know I hurt you plenty when I was ill, but I saw how good you were to me, how you fought to save me. How could I ever turn my back on you?" From that moment, they became a true couple, bound by more than just a vow. Emily listened, riveted, but one piece didn't fit. "Charlotte, that's incredible, but what's it got to do with me? And what's this big surprise Ethan's got planned?" Charlotte smiled slyly. "He's holding off on that part, wants to tell you himself. Just wait a little longer." Emily craned her neck toward the door, barely containing her excitement. Soon enough, hoofbeats sounded outside, and there was Ethan, striding up the path. But what made her heart leap was the figure behind him, Tom Bradley, alive and whole. Tears poured down Emily's face as Tom ran to her, wrapping her in his arms. They clung to each other, sobbing with relief. Not only had Ethan and Charlotte come home, but her whole family, 5 strong, was together again. It was more than she'd dared hope for. "How?" she gasped, pulling back to search Tom's face. "What happened? And why am I part of this cure?" Ethan grinned. "It's a long story, sis. Pull up a chair, it all ties back to you and Tom." Ethan settled into a chair, Charlotte at his side, while Emily and Tom sat close, little Jimmy playing at their feet. "All right, sis," Ethan began, "this all starts way back when you and Tom first met. Remember that day up on the ridge?" Emily nodded, recalling it clear as yesterday. She'd been out gathering herbs to sell, her basket half full, when she'd sensed something trailing her. Turning, she'd spotted a huge rattlesnake, wounded, its scales torn, slithering after her with a limp. Terrified, she'd screamed and bolted, only to trip and fall. The snake closed in, and just as panic took over, Tom had burst through the trees, swinging a stick to drive it off. He'd raised the stick to finish it, but Emily, seeing the snake's pained eyes, stopped him. "Don't kill it, Tom, it's hurt, not hunting us." Reluctantly, Tom let it be. The snake didn't slink away. Instead, it nosed toward Emily's spilled basket. Curious, she dumped the herbs out, and the snake snatched one, a scraggly plant she didn't recognize, before dragging itself off. That's how she and Tom had met, bonded by that strange moment. What they didn't know then was that the snake wasn't just any critter. It was a guardian spirit, paired with its mate, tasked by a higher power, an old preacher folk called Reverend Luke, to protect a rare angel root growing on that ridge, waiting for the right soul to claim it. That same day, another creature, a vicious copperhead, had tried to steal the angel root and the snake's power for itself. The guardian pair fought it off, but the female snake took a bad hit. The only thing that could heal her was that odd herb Emily had picked. The male snake tracked her by its scent, too weak to speak but desperate to save his mate. Emily's mercy, sparing him and letting him take the herb, kept them both alive. He'd slithered off to heal her, but their injuries were deep, and they needed time to recover before they could repay the kindness. By then, Emily's parents had passed, she'd married Tom, and Ethan had joined the Harrisons. The snakes watched from afar, guarding the carters quietly. They also kept an eye on Leonard Grayson, whose wickedness they'd long despised. Leonard, obsessed with Emily, had hatched a plan to get Tom out of the way. He'd hired thugs to ambush Tom on the ridge, pushing him off a cliff to fake an accident. But the snakes intervened, catching Tom mid-fall. He was battered and unconscious, too hurt to move, so they staged his death, leaving a bloody decoy to fool Leonard's men, while they nursed him in secret. The male snake, still weakened, sought Reverend Luke's help. The old preacher said, "Only the angel root, fully grown, can save this man now." And the one fated to pick it? That's Ethan Carter, Emily's brother. Why Ethan? Luke explained they'd been tied by fate across lifetimes, him, Ethan, and Emily. He'd planted the angel root years ago, first to repay Ethan's past loyalty, and now to heal Charlotte and right these wrongs. Luke had more to tell. That copperhead wasn't just a snake, it was a dark spirit, feeding on young women's life force to grow stronger. It had latched onto Charlotte, cursing her with those spots and marks, draining her bit by bit. Killing the copperhead outright was impossible until the angel root matured. Once it did, the guardian snakes could use its power to finish the fight. So they waited, guiding Ethan to the ridge when the time was right. Disguised as the grizzled preacher, the male snake met Ethan, handed him the sketch, and sent him up the hill. Ethan harvested the angel root, cured Charlotte, and unknowingly set the stage for more. The snakes ate the leftover root, boosting their strength, then tracked down the copperhead and destroyed it for good. Charlotte's health returned, her beauty and kindness restored, because Emily's mercy had started it all. Charlotte squeezed Ethan's hand, gratitude in her eyes. "If you hadn't spared that snake, Emily, I'd still be lost. And Ethan, your stubborn heart brought me back." But there was more. Leonard's death? That was no accident either. The night he died, he'd been plotting to burn Emily's cabin, kill her in-laws and force her, widowed and alone, into his grasp. The male snake caught wind of it, ambushed Leonard on the road, and bit him dead. A hired hexman traveling with Leonard fought back, slashing the snake deep. Bleeding out, it crashed through Emily's window, and once again her kindness, stitching its wounds, saved it. "We owe you everything," Ethan said. "Those snakes? They've gone off with Reverend Luke to some higher calling now. But before they left, they brought Tom back to me, healed up and ready to come home." Tom hugged Emily tighter, whispering, "I thought I'd lost you forever." Emily wiped her tears, overwhelmed. Her family, Ethan, Charlotte, Tom, Jimmy, and her in-laws, was whole again. The Harrisons handed their farm business over to Ethan, who promptly brought Emily, Tom, and their kin to live nearby, setting them up with a small plot of their own. The two families thrived, their kids and grandkids filling the years with laughter. And that's the tale, Nancy Thompson's voice chimed in, wrapping up her storytelling session. "Folks, we're done with story 1. Stick around, I've got another lined up. You won't want to miss it. Trust me, if this first yarn hooked you, the next one will reel you in deeper. It's an old American folk tale called The Wedding Night Fox. Picture this, a newlywed couple's about to turn in when a fox darts out from under the bed. Back in the day, in Long Hollow County, there was a vegetable farmer named Tommy Lee Foster. Back in the day, in Long Hollow County, there was a vegetable farmer named Tommy Lee Foster. He was an orphan, left behind as a baby. At just 1 year old, he was abandoned at the mouth of a rocky holler 3 miles from Foster's Gap, the little town he'd come to call home. Old man Jed Foster, a weathered farmer heading back from selling greens in the county seat, found him there, wrapped in a rag, bawling his eyes out. Jed, a soft-hearted soul, scooped him up and took him in, naming him Tommy Lee. Jed and his wife Martha had been married for years with no kids of their own. They'd bicker over it plenty, pointing fingers and trading barbs, but deep down, they loved each other fierce. They just had sharp tongues masking tender hearts. When Tommy Lee came into their lives, everything changed. They poured all their care into him, treating him like their own flesh and blood. From then on, the squabbles stopped, and their little cabin hummed with peace. Folks in Foster's Gap noticed the shift and said Jed's kindness had earned him a blessing in return. The Fosters weren't rich, just plain folks scratching out a living from the soil. A good year meant full bellies, but there was never cash to spare for schooling. So Jed kept Tommy Lee close, teaching him the ways of the land, how to plant carrots, tend beans, and coax life from stubborn dirt. "Someday, boy," Jed would say, This'll keep you fed." Tommy Lee soaked it up, knowing how hard his foster folks worked. He was a quiet kid eager to please. By 7 or 8, he was out in the fields with them, hauling water, pulling weeds, doing whatever his small hands could manage. Day by day, Tommy Lee grew up strong and steady. By the time he hit 13, though, trouble rolled into Long Hollow. A plague of locusts swept through, clouds of buzzing devils that stripped fields bare. Crops withered, and plenty of families went hungry. One day, Jed rounded up Tommy Lee and a few neighbors, Uncle Pete and Cousin Amos among them, and they hiked out to a valley beyond town to dig wild roots and catch fish from the creek. After a morning of hard scrabbling, they gathered a modest haul and sat on the grass to catch their breath. Uncle Pete wiped his brow and grumbled, "Ain't no surplus at home. In a lean year like this, we're out here grubbing for roots just to scrape by. Times are tough." Jed nodded. "Weren't like this 12 years back. Rent was fair then, folks could save a little. Now? Ever since Leonard Grayson passed, his widow Marla keeps jacking up the rates. Year after year, it climbs. Even without locusts, we're barely hanging on. Leonard was a decent man, how'd his wife turn so rotten?" Cousin Amos leaned in, voice low. "Think about it now. 12 years ago, Leonard was hale and hearty, no sickness, no accidents. Then he up and dies out of nowhere? Some folks whispered Marla did him in. Sheriff's office didn't care to dig into it though, case went cold." Uncle Pete smirked. "Word is, Sheriff Tate and Marla grew up thick as thieves in the same hollow. Folks say they were sweethearts once. Tate was just a broke scribbler back then, no prospects, so Marla's folks hitched her to Leonard instead. With that tie, you think the sheriff's gonna poke around her husband's grave?" Jed's face darkened at the mention of Tate. That no-good sheriff Tate's a piece of work himself. This locust mess, other counties got relief grain from the governor. Us? Not a kernel. Taxes, though? Piled higher than ever. He's pushing us to the brink. The group sighed and shook their heads, swapping gripes a while longer before trudging home. When Jed and Tommy Lee got back, Jed called out for Martha, but no answer came. He stepped inside and found her sprawled on the bed, still as stone. He touched her forehead, burning hot. Panicked, he and Tommy Lee hauled her to the town dock. The old sawbones shook his head after a look. "She's been frail for a while. This lean year, scant food, threadbare clothes, her body couldn't take it. She's sick bad." He scribbled a prescription for some tonic and sent them off with orders to keep her dosed. Jed tended to Martha day and night, but it wasn't enough. She slipped away, leaving him and Tommy Lee to mourn. They held each other and wept, two souls against the world now. 3 years later, Tommy Lee was 16, built tough from years of labor. He and Jed worked the fields with grit, and their vegetable patch thrived, a sea of green in a hardscrabble life. Tommy Lee took to hauling their harvest to the county seat each day, selling to merchants, while Jed stayed back, weeding and fertilizing. One morning, a bigwig from town ordered a heap of greens for a wedding feast, asking Tommy Lee to cart it straight to his mansion. It kept Tommy Lee busy, leaving no time to tend their usual market stall. Jed waved him off. "I can handle a sack of carrots myself, sell 'em in town. Harvest's good this year. Let's make hay while the sun shines, save up to find you a wife." So they split up, Tommy Lee lugging crates one way, Jed toting a sack the other. Neither knew it'd be the last time they'd see each other alive. That night, Tommy Lee dragged himself home, expecting Jed's familiar whistle. It never came. He waited, pacing the porch, then decided to head to town and look for him. Before he could, Uncle Pete and Cousin Amos showed up, carrying Jed on a plank, their faces grim. Blood matted Jed's hair, and he wasn't moving. Tommy Lee's heart seized. "What happened to Pa?" he demanded, rushing over. Uncle Pete sighed. "He's gone, son. Fell on the road back, hit his head on a rock. We need to lay him to rest quick." Tommy Lee shook his head, frantic. "No way. He was fine this morning." He pressed a hand to Jed's chest. No breath, no pulse. He stumbled back, collapsing in the dirt, tears choking him up. With a neighbor's help, he buried Jed proper, but the loss carved a hole in him that wouldn't heal. A few days after Jed's burial, Tommy Lee cornered Uncle Pete and Cousin Amos at the edge of the vegetable patch. "Look," he said, voice tight, "I need the real story. How'd pa die? Don't feed me no more lines. Cousin Amos shifted uncomfortably. We told you, Tommy Lee. He tripped, hit his head on a rock. That's how it happened. Tommy Lee's eyes narrowed. That gash on his head didn't look like no rock, did it? More like a club or a stick. You holding out on me? Uncle Pete put a hand on his shoulder. Son, don't go stirring up trouble. It was an accident, plain and simple. Let it rest. No matter how Tommy Lee pressed, they stuck to the same tale. Frustrated, he took his cart of greens to the county seat the next day, asking around among the market folks he knew. Every vendor echoed Pete and Amos. Same words, same shrugs. It gnawed at him, a riddle he couldn't crack. That evening, lost in thought as he hauled his empty cart home, Tommy Lee didn't notice a young woman crossing his path until he bumped her hard. She stumbled, and he snapped out of his daze, dropping the cart handles. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, didn't see you there," he stammered, reaching to steady her. She brushed off her skirt and waved him off. "It's all right, no harm done." Tommy Lee got a good look at her then. Fair skin, maybe 16 or 17, with a worn satchel slung over her shoulder. She caught his eye and asked, "Hey mister, could you point me to Lion's Den Road in East Town? I'm here to visit kin, first time in these parts. I'd be obliged if you could steer me right." Tommy Lee scratched his neck, feeling bad about the collision. "It's a few twists and turns from here, hard to explain in a sentence or two. Tell you what, I'll walk you there." She thanked him profusely, and they set off, weaving through the dusty streets. She pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket, checked it, then led him to a weathered house at the end of a narrow lane. She knocked softly. Tommy Lee tipped his hat and started to leave, but a commotion stopped him cold. A man's voice bellowed from inside, followed by the door slamming shut. Tommy Lee spun around to see the girl crouched on the stoop, sobbing into her hands. He hurried back. "What's wrong, miss?" She hiccuped through tears. "My uncle, he won't take me in. My folks are dead, and I've got nowhere to go. I don't know what to do."
Tommy Lee's heart sank.
She looked as lost as he'd felt burying Jed. "Listen," he said, "I've got an extra room at my place, but a lone gal staying with me wouldn't look right, folks talk. How about this? Come back to Foster's Gap with me.
My Aunt's got space. She's a good sort.
You can stay there while we figure things out." She blinked up at him. "That's awful kind, but won't it put her out?" "Nah," Tommy Lee grinned. "We're simple folks round here. Someone's in a bind, the whole town pitches in. You'll see." She nodded, wiping her face, and followed him back to the hollow. On the way, she opened up a bit. Her name was Maggie Vaughn, born to a bookish family that fell on hard times. With her parents gone, she'd come looking for her uncle, only to get turned away. "What's your uncle's name?" Tommy Lee asked. "Hank Bullock," she said. Tommy Lee frowned. "Heard of him. Word is he lost big gambling a while back. Can't hardly feed his own, let alone take you in." By the time they reached Foster's Gap, folks were already hollering, "Tommy Lee, where'd you snag such a pretty bride?" Maggie's cheeks went pink, and he laughed, waving them off.
"She's just a friend, y'all, settle down."
They headed straight to Aunt Sally's, a cozy cabin with a sagging porch. Tommy Lee explained Maggie's plight, and Sally didn't hesitate. "Child, this is your home now. Stay as long as you need." From then on, Tommy Lee dropped off fresh greens and whatever else he could spare at Sally's door. Maggie, not one to freeload, pitched in, cooking, cleaning, even helping Tommy Lee tend the garden. Sometimes she'd tag along to the county seat, hawking vegetables beside him. They fell into an easy rhythm, two young folks leaning on each other in a hard world. One evening, a farmer from a nearby hamlet ordered a sack of turnips. Tommy Lee delivered it late, the sun long gone by the time he started home. Trudging alone down a quiet mountain trail, he froze as a fox darted out from the brush. It planted itself in his path and spoke, clear as day, "Tell me, do I look like a man or a spirit?"
Tommy Lee's blood ran cold.
Old-timers had warned him about this. Foxes asking riddles, testing folks. Say man, and it might turn human. Say spirit, and it could ascend to something higher. Say nothing, and its power would fade. Most folks clammed up, scared of what a stronger fox might do. Tommy Lee kept his mouth shut and stepped past it. The fox trotted after him, insistent. Why won't you answer? Just say I'm a man, it'll boost my strength, let me take human form. It's nothing to you, just a word. Why not help me? Tommy Lee stopped, turning to face it. I'm a farmer, fox. All I know's this, you don't work, you don't eat.
No pine, no gain. You want so meeting big. You gotta ianite wat vi you evadone for us?
Why should I hand you a shortcut? The fox tilted its head, then bowed low. Thank you.
I get it now.
With that, it slipped back into the woods. Soon after, tales spread through the hollow, foxes helping folks out of jams, guiding lost travelers, chasing off pests. Tommy Lee figured his words had sunk in. But peace didn't last. One day, he got back from market to find Aunt Sally frantic. Tommy Lee, that no-good Leroy Grayson, Marla's boy, came with his cronies and snatched Maggie. Said he's making her his kept woman.
Tommy Lee's gut twisted.
Leroy was a rotten apple, mean as a snake and twice as crooked, just like his ma Marla. Leonard Grayson had been the good one in that family.
Grabbing a stut hickory stick, Tommy Lee started for the Gräsong estate.
Pete and Amos blocked his path.
You can't go, son.
The Graysons got money, men, and Sheriff Tate in their pocket.
You'll get yourself killed. Evil don't scare me, Tommy Lee shot back. Good folks don't bow too bad honest. I ain't letting Leroy ruin Maggie. I'm bringing her back.
Amos grabbed his arm. Your pa told us before he died, don't let you chase revenge. You're the last Foster left.
Tommy Lee frotze.
What's that mean? Was Leroy the one who? Amos sighed, defeated.
No use heeding it now.
That day Jed died, Leroy was tearing through town on horseback, drunk as a skunk. Nearly ran down a kid in the street.
Je zwang a Pole, knocket ze horse of Kurse, savet ze Jungen.
Leroy flew into a rage, grabbed a cudgel, and cracked Jed's skull. He didn't last long after that. Jed made us swear not to tell, didn't want you tangling with Leroy and ending up dead too. Tommy Lee's fists clenched white. That settles it. I'm going, for Pa and for Maggie.
Bloddieb don't weit.
Pete and Amos tried to wrestle him back, but he wouldn't budge.
Onkel Pete and Cousin Amos drage Tommy Lee into the cabin, locking the door dicht.
You hard-headed fool, Pete muttered.
Lero's got a posse, who you gonna fight that?
But Tommy Lee wasn't one to sit still. He climbed the rafters, grabbed his hickory stick, and bashed through the shingle roof. Dropping to the ground, he sprinted toward the Grayson estate, heart pounding with fury. The Grayson place loomed ahead, a big gaudy house ringed by high fences. Tommy Lee circled it, stick in hand, but he couldn't see a way in past the gates and guards. He slumped against a tree, racking his brain, when a familiar fox padded up. I'll get you through, it said, voice low. Tommy Lee recognized it, the same critter from the trail. Without a word, the fox started digging, claws tearing into the dirt.
In minutes, etched carved a tunnel under the fence.
Tommy Lee crawled after it, emerging in the shadowed yard. The fox led him through the grounds, silent as a ghost, right up to a back room where Maggie was held. Two roughnecks stood guard outside, grumbling. Boss is washing up, one said. Once he's done, we're off duty.
The fox whispered, Il handle, go get here.
It snatched two pebbles, flicked them with uncanny aim, crack, crack, and both men dropped like sacks of meal.
Tommy Lee bolted inside.
Maggie was there, wrists bound to a bedpost, eyes wide with fear. He cut the ropes with his pocket knife, whispering, We're getting out now. She clung to him as they slipped out, the fox waiting. You'll go, it said.
Ivy got so meeting to grab.
It darted toward the east wing while Tommy Lee and Maggie raced back through the tunnel. They couldn't risk Foster's Gap. Leroy'd come looking. Tommy Lee led Maggie to an old hunting shack in the valley where he'd once dug roots with Jed. Panting, they ducked inside. Maggie caught her breath and looked at him, eyes shining.
Tommy Lee, you came alone, for me. Let's get it straight here. If I'm your wife, my Leroy LL back off.
They'd grown close over months, feelings simmering beneath the surface.
Tommy Lee hesitated. Ain't much here, Maggie, just a shack. You deserve better.
I don't care, she said.
Long as Ivy got you, it's enough.
We'll take the sky as our witness, the earth as our preacher, marry me now. So they knelt in the dirt, swearing vows to each other, sealing it with a kiss. A makeshift wedding, but it felt real. They were about to settle in when the fox burst from under the cot, urgent. Move, Leroy's men are closing in. Tommy Lee and Maggie dove for the tunnel it had dug beneath the shack, scrambling out just as shouts echoed behind them. They stumbled into the open, turning to see the fox staggering, blood dripping from its muzzle.
Tommy Lee knelt. What happened to you?
The fox pressed a ledger into his hands. 3 years back, that locust plague relief grain came from the state, but Sheriff Tate and Marla Grayson sold it off. People starved. This book's the proof.
Take it to Judge Lehman up in the Ike Circuit. Make MP.
It coughed, weakening. Got caught snagging it, took a beating.
I ain't long for this world.
Tommy Lee frowned. Can't you foxes hex folks, make him crazy? The fox locked eyes with him.
Tell me, am I man or a spirit?
You're a spirit, Tommy Lee said firm. A beam of light shot down from the sky, swallowing the fox whole, and it was gone. Tommy Lee and Maggie clutched the ledger, hightailing it to Judge Lyman's court. The judge, a stern man with a white beard, slammed the book shut after reading it. Thieving officials bleeding the poor dry, I'll see justice done. Lyman rode into Long Hollow with a posse, digging up the rot. Turns out, when Marla wed Leonard Grayson, she was already carrying Sheriff Tate's kid, Leroy. Leonard found out later, planned to kick her out and leave everything to his son by a mistress, Jimmy Grayson. Marla and Tate got wind of it, poisoned Leonard first, and pinned it on bad luck. They'd stumbled on Jimmy fleeing with his ma, left him near Foster's Gap, and chased her down, killed her too. That baby? Tommy Lee Foster himself, taken in by Jed. Judge Lyman hauled Tate, Marla, and Leroy to trial. Evidence piled high, the ledger, witnesses, old letters. All three got the gallows, hanged public in the town square. Folks cheered as the nooses dropped, glad to see the wicked brought low. Tommy Lee, revealed as Jimmy Grayson, claimed his birthright, Leonard's land and wealth. He didn't let it change him though. Like his pa Leonard, he kept rents low, gave to the needy, and helped any family in a pinch. He and Maggie settled into a quiet life, raising kids and grandkids in peace. And that's the end, folks, Nancy Thompson signed off. If you liked this tale, drop a comment below. Subscribe, share it round. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.